I was living in Hong Kong. It was a warm night. The time was 1 a.m., and that seemed to be the magic hour that I happened to be getting home every day for the last 60 days, because I was in the rising ranks of investment banking in the mergers and acquisition team. And that night, just before I opened the door, I paused, and I looked across left and right in the empty streets and up into the amazing skylines of Hong Kong, and thought to myself, Herry, what are you doing? Why on earth are you spending your life and your youth doing something in the office where you actually don't care about? And at that point, I paused and I cried because I didn't have an answer for myself. I realized that I have to go back and to listen to my inner voice. And my inner voice was telling me that I have to find a purpose. The answer wasn't to go out there and find a new job or to find another role. I knew it was something deeper within. So I made a decision to drop everything and go on an adventure. My management of the firm at the time, they scratched their heads and they said, things are going so well, but if you must go, fine, you can go on a sabbatical. So, with no other purpose than to find my purpose and to have fun, I went on a journey. I went on a journey diving into cultures, into nature, into dancing on the streets of Havana, singing on the beaches in Curacao, and spending time deep in the rainforests in the Amazon with the indigenous tribes and the medicine men. And deep in the jungles, nature seemed to speak to me. Mother Nature said, there are things that's happening on this earth that aren't quite right. And what I was seeing proved that. There were plumes of black smoke in the middle of Amazonian jungle from oil and gas industry that should not be there. Where water used to be abundant was a dry desert. And all of these stimuli made me realize, and it imbued me with a sense of passion and an understanding that me as an individual have a role to play. So with that sense of urgency as well as passion, I went back to the real world. And oh my, what a time it was. You see, it was clear that the population was continuing to grow exponentially. The middle class was also ever increasing. Consumption, as a result, was also increasing exponentially, but the resources was not. There is no plan B, and there was no planet B, and the resources were finite. Climate change was real and is real. As I entered back into the real world, it was a monumental time in 2015, as Paris Agreement happened at COP21 under the United Nations General Assembly. 193 nations came together and agreed that the world cannot go up more than 2 degrees scenario at most. At the same time, the Sustainable Development Goals happened also under the auspices of United Nations, where the world was given a framework to talk about and discuss in a unified language what it means to have impact. So 17 goals with 169 underlying goals were created that its divergence so wide all the way from no poverty to clean energy to justice and peace. And there are reasons why not only governments, but companies are taking heed of sustainable development. Out of many factors, one is retaining talent. And many of these millennials today are saying, I don't want to join a company that isn't giving back to the society. Businesses, as they look at sustainable development, it also requires enormous amount of funding, sums that we cannot even fathom in the trillions. And that requires the type of funding called sustainable finance that doesn't only take into account financial returns, but also perhaps the unseen drivers in the bottom line today, including environmental, social, and governance aspects. So let me just share with you the journey that the sustainable finance community has been on. The first step was to say, risk mitigation. Let's make sure that we're not harming the environment, we're not harming the humanity, and at the same time making sure that there's no liability on our balance sheets. And that sense of risk mitigation evolved over time to say, okay, by doing no harm, we have to contribute to the society. And so companies and financial institutions started to come out with policies that said, for example, no more coal financing, because coal was so materially out of line in coming to a 2-degree scenario pathway. The investor community also came together almost 2 decades ago to say that there needs to be a set of principles that investors must heed by in order to be able to incorporate environmental, social, and governance aspects into the way that they invest. And that's called United Nations or UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which currently has almost 2,000 signatories and 81 trillion US dollars worth of assets under management. And under these principles, it doesn't mean that the money has to be given away on the philanthropic basis. Financial sustainability is also important. So they're looking at ways, how do we actually incorporate these environment, social governance aspects whilst also being financially sustainable? Another movement that the investors have initiated and currently ongoing is what's called Climate Action 100+, which represents 289 investors and almost 30 trillion worth of capital. And they are looking to work with those companies that are heavy emitters of greenhouse gases and seeing how can they curb emissions, how can they make their business more sustainable, and how can they improve the disclosures that they do around financial risks related to climate change. And why are these investors, the pension funds where you put your money towards in the government pension funds, the asset owners, institutional investors, and the money that you put into the stock markets and bonds, why is this so important in the hierarchy of finances? That's because the total financial capital market system represents about 140 trillion worth of assets, 96 trillion in bonds, and just under 46 trillion in equity capital markets. And it is this capital coming from the top which filters into the capital markets and gets shifted into, as investments into companies, corporates, and banking institutions. One of the movements, one of the products that has taken off is called green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds. And mind you, I say it has taken off. In the grand scheme of 100 trillion, almost 100 trillion worth of bond capital markets outstanding, green bonds still today account for less than 1%. We must come to a time where all bonds and also all finance is actually sustainable finance or green bonds or sustainability bonds. So we're far from there yet. But the investors and companies are looking to demonstrate and show in a transparent manner where the money is going. And often people think when we talk about sustainability, it only means renewable energy. Far from that. BlackRock, which is one of the largest investors in the world today, said the impact of their portfolio of green bond investments is actually far larger than the impact of the renewable energy investments. Let me give you a couple examples of 2 companies that you may know. There's a company called Apple, who currently represent about 2% of the total equity capital markets out there because they have recently just hit 1 trillion mark when it comes to market capitalization. They raised 2.5 billion US dollars in green bond. And some of the uses that they put this towards is the state-of-the-art headquarters, the Apple Park, or a donut. It may look like a donut. And they have further made all of their operations now 100% renewable energy sourced, and they're putting efforts towards making their supply chain closed loop. So using the resources and putting it back into the beginning of the cycle. So one of the uses was this robot that can dismantle iPhones at super, super high speed, up to 200 phones per hour. And it'll take apart all the precious metal parts and important parts, and they'll put that back into the manufacturing system. Another company that you just may know, called Starbucks. Now, Starbucks has been one of the key drivers in the coffee market, where they are setting standards as to what it means to have sustainable coffee. They worked with a large NGO called Conservation International to come up with 249 indicators as to what it means to have sustainable coffee along the supply chain, agricultural practices, distribution, and so on. So out of the $500 million raised, as well as yen sustainability bond that they had raised, much of that went into sourcing sustainable coffee, and some of it also went to support farmers' development in sustainable agriculture. But the capital markets aren't the only developments that we have been seeing. The loan market, where the bankings actually deploy their own balance sheet to lend, have also been innovating. It is the bank's intentions in the transactions that I described to try to reward companies that are looking to improve their environmental, social, governance standards. So if the overall sustainability improves, then the banks actually reward them with a discount in the loan pricing. And this type of transaction has been picking up in the last year and a half or so, and large companies, Olam, which is a large agricultural business, Royal Philips, a healthcare business, Renewy, which is a waste-to-product business, as well as DSM, which is a chemicals business, have signed on because they want to demonstrate to the financial community that they are looking to make a difference with their business. And in that process, the CFOs and the treasurers of each of these companies become stakeholders in their company's movement towards becoming more sustainable. Now, so I've just talked about transactions that's already happened. But I can also tell you we're very far from reaching the goals on the Paris Agreement as well as the Sustainable Development Goals. I will reinforce the message that you heard earlier, that we cannot continue on a linear economy where we produce, use, and waste. The new economy that we're moving towards is called circular economy or donut economy, where you're looking to reuse, reduce, and recycle. And along the way, you're looking at extending the life of the assets and increasing the usage or productivity of the assets that sit idle. Think of Uber, think of Airbnb. And all of this requires rethinking in the financial terms. The concept of security, you see, that banks take an asset and say, I will lend you money on the back of this asset, and if you don't pay me back, I will take this asset. That may no longer hold in concepts where ownership is unclear, or the movement of this asset as it gets segregated to make it more nimble and to increase the productivity also changes the concept of security. And so the banks need to also continue innovating in financial models to fund the circular economy. Not only that, in my mind, technological innovations is and should be synonymous with sustainable development. You see the demand for things like connected infrastructure, Internet of Things, mobile connectivity. Much of the demand for this is going to be feeding directly into sustainable development. All those trillions that I mentioned that the world needs in order to achieve the goals that we want to under SDGs and Paris Agreement, much of that goes to connected infrastructure, for example, where you must be able to real-time assess, is there leakage in water? Is there energy efficiency going down of certain assets? And all of this requires Internet of Things. And one big black box that often does not get connected to sustainable development, or in the minds of most people for that matter, quantum computing. It is the most powerful computer out there today, far beyond supercomputers. And it's all about being able to look at very complex set of potential outcomes and being able to compute that at super speed. And climate change, 2-degree scenario pathway, looking at the best drug pathways. These are all scenario building exercises in order to get to optimal solutions, and quantum computing is going to change the world. And we must make sure that from day one, when we look at quantum computing, and as the technology develops and matures and can be put under commercial use, that this gets connected to sustainable development. So all of this is happening today. But it cannot happen without people who stand up and say, I think this is important. And even though I may feel that I don't have the resources, I don't have the skill set, but you have to believe that you can make a difference. And these heroes and heroines and the change makers are actually all among us. You guys are here because you're open-minded, you want to learn, and you want to drive towards change. So in the context of sustainable finance, powering sustainable development in order to help the community and the humanity to thrive, we can each go out and talk to your banker friends, your investor friends, your own company, to ask, what are we doing in order to support sustainable development, to support the Paris Agreement, to support the Sustainable Development Goals? It so happens that I was fortunate to have been unhappy in in investment banking, because that's what drove me to go out and find my purpose in that. Please join me and join a large community of us in driving that change, in saying there is no plan B, there is no planet B, and for us to thrive, we must stand up and support the sustainable development movement. Thank you.